helpful. So perhaps it will be easier to think of our sort of broad research question, are we smarter after exercise? And I'll make that a bit more precise as we go along. Okay, so here's my outline. We've got a skeleton because it's like the skeleton of the slideshow. So I'm going to start out by introducing the Stroop task, which is an example of executive functioning, and talk about what that means, and then do the same sort of thing with Raven's matrices, which are an example of fluid intelligence. Again, I'll talk about what that means. And then we'll be able to move on to talk about how these things are related to each other and how they're related to exercise. And then we can talk about my results and implications once we get to there. Okay, so the Stroop task. So imagine you're a participant. You're sitting at a computer and a word appears on the screen. The word is a color word and it is written in some color. So these are the colors that are available, red, green, blue, and black. And your job is to indicate the color of the letters, not the meaning of the word. So this has been mentioned in previous presentations, but essentially what's going on is that you need to ignore this stimulus of the actual word you're reading, and instead focus on the color of the letters. So this is the challenge is to do this as quickly and as accurately as you can. Okay, so there's really three different cases. So one case, you get just like a colored rectangle that comes up, and this is called a neutral stimulus because there's no word there for you to read. It's just a color. So the correct response here would just press the blue button. Okay, and then you can get a congruent stimulus as well. So here you have the word black written in black letters. So the correct response would just be to press the black button. And then we have an incongruent stimulus here, so we have the word blue written in red. The correct response here is to press the red button. Okay, so it's more difficult to do an incongruent stimulus because you see the word blue, you want to press blue, but really you need to sort of stop yourself. And so this is measuring response inhibition. Essentially you have one part of your brain that says, oh, I see blue, I want to press blue, and another part of your brain says, no, hold on, we got to press the red button instead. And so you'd expect the incongruent stimuli to also take a little bit longer to react to. Okay, so more broadly, this is a type of executive function, and here's sort of a traditional definition of executive functioning. So things like planning, decision-making, error correction, and importantly for us, resisting temptation. So that's essentially what you're doing with the Stroop task, and that's what makes the Stroop task an executive functioning task. And we'll get to the details of this a little bit later, but the Stroop, or executive functioning, tends to come from sort of this area of the brain, and we'll make that also more precise as we go. Okay, so how does this interact with exercise? So if you exercise now, the research suggests if you exercise now and you sort of give yourself 5 minutes to recover, then your executive functioning will improve. You will do better on this kind of task than if you hadn't exercised. Okay, now we'll sort of move on to Raven's matrices, and then we'll connect the two. So this thing is called a matrix. You've got this 3x3 array of images, and the bottom right image is missing, as you can see. And you get options. So usually you have 8 options, but here I'm just showing you 4 to keep it simple. And the idea is you pick up on the pattern that's going on in this matrix, and you choose whichever image fits best into that bottom right-hand corner. So in this case, this would be the right choice. No points if you guessed that, but that would be the right choice. And yeah, so you would have a series of these matrices. It's called Raven's advanced progressive matrices because they start sort of easier and then they get harder as you go, which gives us a nice scale. Okay, so Raven's matrices measure fluid intelligence, which is broadly speaking reasoning and problem-solving ability. But I like this definition, which is not in conflict. It's just a sort of a different way of stating it, because this definition says analyzing complex patterns, which is a great description of Raven's matrices. You have a complex pattern, and you need to analyze it and predict what should come next. Okay. Now, does exercise affect fluid intelligence? Nobody knows. I mean, we usually assume that it's stable, but nobody's done an experiment like this before. So we don't know. Okay, but we do know that intelligence is positively correlated with executive functioning. It's positively correlated with a lot of things, but executive functioning is particularly strong. And And so that suggests there might be some kind of common mechanism between the two. Okay, so they're not exactly the same, but there might be some kind of common mechanism. We also have some neurophysiological data to support this. So, so you can see here a map of the brain. And if I just sort of highlight this area, this is approximately the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is an area that's very closely associated with executive function. This is the part of your brain that's essentially telling the other parts what to do. And now these regions are all regions that are associated with performance on intelligence tasks. And so you can see they're sort of all over the place, but they line up very nicely with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that suggests that there may be a common mechanism, and of course if there is a mechanism, then this is where it would be. Okay, so here's the issue. So executive functioning, we're quite confident changes after exercise. But fluid intelligence is supposed to be stable. We usually pretend that if we check your fluid intelligence now and we check your fluid intelligence later, it should be about the same. So this is sort of weird, like a weird contradiction. And so we tried to address this. And so we took some young adults, 18 to 35 years old, and we had them come in twice. So the first time they came in, they did some low-intensity exercise. They rode a bicycle ergometer for 20 minutes, and after that, they had a moment to recover, and they did a Stroop task and Raven's matrices. Then they came in again. The second time, they did a high-intensity exercise session, and then again, Stroop task, Raven's matrices, same sort of idea. And at the end of the second session, they would do some questionnaires. Now, this was also counterbalanced, so half of the participants did it this way, the other half did high intensity first. But essentially, this was the design. And the way we measured intensity here was by their perceived exertion, so we kept track of how much they thought, how hard they thought they were working. We kept track of their heart rate as well. And we also took a look at their power, although power output is a little bit difficult to gauge by in this context. And so the idea is that the low intensity session is kind of the control here. So this was at such a low intensity that we really couldn't have gone any lower without the resistance being so low that you're like pedaling squares. So so this was supposed to be a control for the high intensity treatment. Okay, so you thought you were going to see results, right? So no, there are results coming, but first let me just explain how they're going to look. So we've got a color coding scheme, and here on our vertical axis we can see reaction time plus or minus standard error. And note that we're starting this at 600, just so that 600 milliseconds, so that you can see the effect a little bit more clearly. And so what we would normally expect to see from a Stroop task is something like this. So this is from our low intensity trials, and you can see that the incongruent stimuli take longer to respond to than the congruent or neutral stimuli. So if you recall, incongruent stimuli are more difficult because those are the ones where you have to stop yourself from doing something and then do something else. So, so it makes sense that we would see this, and this confirms that our participants were like okay and doing the Stroop task the way we would expect people to do the Stroop task. Okay, now's the moment of truth. What's going to happen? Okay, so this is what happened. I'm not going to say that there's an effect here. There isn't. So you can see that nothing is really changing from the low intensity to the high intensity. Like maybe like a teensy, but it doesn't count. And so we're seeing no improvement, and we'll get to why in a moment. But maybe this would cause you to ask the question, okay, what happened with Raven's matrices? Well, this is what happens with Raven's matrices. So nothing happens again, no improvement. Okay, so then you might say, okay, but what about, okay, so we've adjusted for a bunch of things. We've adjusted for age, for sex, for history of physical activity, for English fluency, a bunch of other things. And no matter how you slice the data, there's still no effects. And like there's pretty robustly no effects. It's not like it looks like maybe there's an effect, like there's no effect. Okay, so what we found is that there's no effect of exercise intensity on executive functioning or fluid intelligence. The question is why? Why didn't we come to these findings? Because they seem to be in contradiction with what the previous literature has done. So in order to answer this question, we need to maybe go back and think about the previous literature. So a couple of differences. So the first difference is that previous literature compares an exercise condition to a rest condition. So we had a control where participants were still moving and they still felt like they were exercising. It's possible that there's some kind of placebo effect going on. It's possible there's some other effect going on. But we're using sort of different control conditions, and so that's one thing that leads to a different effect. The other one is that a lot of the literature focuses on neurophysiological effects. So, for example, measuring electrical activity in the brain or measuring blood flow in the brain, and some research reports an effect in the sort of neurophysiological level, but doesn't report any kind of behavioral effect. So this is another difference. Now we did collect data data on blood flow through functional near-infrared spectroscopy, but that is not analyzed yet, and so we're not going to make any conclusions as of now. So these are sort of the two differences between what we did and what previous research has generally done. Okay, so previous research says that exercise improves executive functioning performance, and our research says that there's really no difference if you do high-intensity exercise versus low-intensity exercise. Maybe this is good news, right? So if you're just looking for the cognitive benefits, then going for a 30-minute walk is just as good as going for a 30-minute jog. There are other sort of effects of exercise, so this isn't to say high intensity is exactly the same, but in terms of the particular things that we were looking at. Okay, but the remaining question, and this is what we failed to answer in this case, and what needs to be answered in the future, is whether or not exercise affects fluid intelligence. If we had structured this experiment more similarly to previous experiments, would we have seen an effect on fluid intelligence? And that's something that has to be answered in the future. Before I sign off, I just want to thank everybody who contributed to this project. So the NeuroFit Lab, particularly my supervisor, Dr. Jen Heiss, has been amazing. It's been great. I want to thank Barb and Anna, who have been great mentors and advisors during this, and their contribution has been excellent. Carolina and Yidan did a lot of data collection and scored most of the questionnaires, and I really couldn't have done this without any of these people. On sort of a broader scale, my experience at university wouldn't have been the same if it went for McMaster, if it went for the iSci program. Specifically, I want to thank iTeach because you guys have been the most amazing instructional team ever. And I'm very thankful. I also want to thank Synthesis for allowing me to present, and of course the iSci class of 2017, because you guys are awesome, amazing people, and don't ever change. Or like, you know, you're allowed to change, but stay awesome, stay awesome. And lastly, I want to thank my parents, because I wouldn't have been able to do what I did if I didn't have parents like this. They didn't actually do anything for me. But having them as parents sort of contributed to my ability to do this. And lastly, I want to thank you guys for being here and listening. Let's get a question already.
So you were showing the response times in the stroke test. Can you also look at the errors that people made, and was there anything significant in that?
So for better or for worse, people didn't really make many mistakes. We had, I think, one or two participants who didn't make a single error, and of all of the other participants, none of them made a lot of errors. So nobody made a lot of errors. There isn't really much to take out of that. The data that went into making that graph is only data that didn't have any errors. This is only correct responses.
And then,
yeah.
To follow up on that, if you, like the previous research that has showed that executive functioning was affected by exercise, if it was also stroke test, I don't know if you looked at if it was done with like a button response like you were doing, or if it was a verbal one, because sometimes the responses are different based on that method and what I was looking at in the mindfulness literature.
Yeah, I can't say that I know for every study, but at least some of the studies, and particularly a couple of studies that are most similar to us, use also sort of a automated button sort of strategy. Yeah. Yes, Elsie.
Do you think that exposure could have played a role? Like if you did this for another week and they came in and every time they would have done this, there would have been a different result at the end?
Like, do you think you're saying was there a practice effect?
Yeah, like if they exercise like every day for 2 weeks, would you expect a higher thing?
So there are studies that look at that kind of thing. So that's sort of the difference between a chronic effect and and an acute effect. So in this case, we want to see if there's an effect right away. We don't want to see, like, it's interesting, but the point of this wasn't to see whether there would be an effect a long time afterwards. It's worth noting that there was actually an effect that I didn't tell you guys about. The only effect was a practice effect. People got better in their second session than they were in their first session just because they had exposure to the task beforehand, so they had practice. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Sorry, that's all the time about predictions.
Okay. Thank you.